So for our next segment, we're evaluating whether Trump has solved the healthcare crisis in the United States, or at least one tiny little part of it, with an executive order that he put out on Monday, which attempts to coax pharmaceutical companies in order to lower their prices in the United States. And so when I first saw this news, I was like, damn, is this actually good things coming out of the Trump administration to try to reduce the cost of prescription drugs for Americans who pay up to 10 times more for medications than people in other wealthy nations? So we wanted to dive into it and figure out if that actually is a good thing that Trump is trying to pull off.
Yeah. So one thing I will say is that it's complicated, and I don't actually have a definitive answer for you. For the most part, my final conclusion is going to be somewhat speculative, but also speculative that could potentially be proven wrong. All right. And there are definitely pieces of evidence to support this being something that might actually be significant. And there are some pieces of evidence to support that this might just be a big nothing. So I'm going to kind of walk you all through kind of my whole process in terms of seeing this and how the picture started to kind of shape up the more I was looking at this. So let's start out with the speech that Trump gave, kind of presenting this. It started out basically with Trump talking about an experience that he had with a friend of his who apparently is extremely fat, and he felt the need to keep harping on that this friend is really fat, who was using what Trump called a fat shot. And he was in Britain and found that it was significantly less expensive in Britain than it is in the United States. Now, I'm not sure which drug he's talking about, whether it's like Wegovy or whatnot. But it is true, as Michael pointed out, that drugs in the United States tend to be much more expensive than drugs in other countries. On average, they're usually about 3 times as expensive. As Michael pointed out, sometimes they can be upwards of 10 times as expensive. As it stands currently, about 90% of prescription drugs are actually off-brand. However, the off-brand drugs only account for 1/5 of our overall spending, which means that when you're looking at that 10%, which are going to be your drugs that basically pharmaceutical companies own patents on and are able to jack the prices way up on, things like insulin. When you're looking at stuff like that, that's where they really price gouge us. Now, when Trump was talking about this, he made a statement, and this was kind of my first thought of, oh, this might actually be bullshit.
Yeah.
He made a statement where he said basically that the reason why the United States pays so much in drugs in compared to other countries is because other countries are, they're not paying their fair share.
Sure.
We are subsidizing other countries.
Yeah. Which
now
might be true in theory, but is not true in fact, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, So this is actually a sentiment that is often echoed by the pharmaceutical industry. So there was a pharmaceutical lobbyist in response to this, a guy named Stephen J. Ubi, I think that's how you say his name, who is the president and CEO of Pharma. And he basically echoed that same sentiment, that the reason why Americans pay so much more in drugs is specifically because the rest of the world pays so much less. Now, there are many reasons why that's wrong, and there are many easy ways in which we can demonstrate that that is just factually incorrect. First off, on its face, that makes it sound like, oh, so what you're saying is that the pharmaceutical industry just randomly decided, well, one of these countries is going to have to pick up the slack. I guess it's going to be the United States. That's not how it fucking works. So in most countries, there is one regulatory body that is able to set the prices of pharmaceutical drugs. Now, in some cases, it could be because there is a single payer system, which means that, there's only one buyer, which means they have a significant amount of purchasing power. In some cases, if we're talking about mandate systems, it might be a specific government agency that will regulate those. But the problem is, because we have this multi-tiered system of various different private companies that have very little insight, and there's very little oversight, and there's very little oversight on the pharmaceutical industry as a whole when it comes to pricing. The prices tends to be set through negotiations with those individual private insurers. And because of that, because there's a lot of competition there between those private insurers, that means that the pharmaceutical industry, on the drugs that they have patents over, have a lot of negotiating power when it comes to the prices.
Yeah.
So basically, think of it this way. Say there are 10 private insurance companies, and there is a pharmaceutical company that has a specific drug that is heavily needed to fight some common disease, right? When that pharmaceutical company goes to these insurance companies and says, all right, well, this needs to be a part of your coverage because people are going to specifically need it, and they will choose your insurance company or your specific plan because it will cover this. However, we're going to set it at this price. Then the insurance company says, well, that's too much. We're not going to pay that. And the pharmaceutical person can basically say, okay, well, then I'll just go to the 10 other people that can, or the 9 other people that can. Because there's almost no negotiating power and the federal government does very little regulation, the United States pays significantly more. In order for the idea of the United States actually subsidizing other countries, in order for that idea to be true, that would basically have to mean that the profit margins of pharmaceutical industries would be about in line with the profit margins of other industries. So let's look at the profit margins of pharmaceutical companies versus other companies. So there was actually a study that was done in the JAMA network that was comparing the profit margin. Now, in this case, keep in mind, profit margin means when we're looking at profit margin, you're looking at your revenue, but you are subtracting from that your labor costs and your non-labor costs. Labor costs being the salaries of the people that are working for you, non-labor costs being anything else. It could be advertisement, it could be research and development, anything that is not a part of that, anything that is not paid into labor or non-labor costs is then kept as profit, right? So as it stands, when this study was looking at 357 S&P traded companies that were not part of the pharmaceutical industry, they found that those S&P companies tended to have a 37.4% profit margin, meaning that 37.4% of the revenue that they were getting did not have to be used for those, either those labor costs or those non-labor costs. They were able to just pocket that. That's your general area for these major S&P companies. Now, if it were true that these pharmaceutical companies that have to charge Americans significantly more, if it was true that the only reason why they have to do that is because they're just they have so much cost, there's so much cost involved, they're chopping at the bit for those profits, and they just got to do that in order to be even somewhat profitable, then their profit margin would be somewhat in line with the S&P companies, right?
Yeah, if not lower. Yeah.
If not lower. Yeah. Except this same study found that for pharmaceutical companies, they tended to have a profit margin of 76.5%, meaning that 76.5% of the revenue they were taking in went to profits. Again, compare that to 37.4% for the S&P companies that were looked at. Their profit margins are not an issue here. They have, like, the pharmaceutical industry is uniquely profitable. And the reason for that is because of price gouging. So we've talked about this before, all right? You know, just to very briefly go through the process, we've talked about how pharmaceutical drugs tend to be developed in the United States. Basically, when it comes to the early funding of drugs, back when they're the most risky because we don't know if they're actually going to develop into something, that tends to be funded by the government. It tends to be funded in the form of grants to universities. Then, when a drug starts to show promise, these companies will basically sweep in, buy the patents, and then develop it the rest of the way once they have determined that this is not going to be super risky for us. All right, which means that every single new developed drug in the last decade has at some point of the process, and like I said, normally the point of the process is when it's at its most risky, has been funded by taxpayer money.
Yeah.
Which means that they're basically sweeping in and taking advantage of the tax money that you put in order to fund the development of these drugs, and then they are price gouging you at the back end, and they are pocketing 76.5% of the revenue that they take in from that. They are pocketing that as profit.
Yeah.
Which is almost double the profit margins of other industries.
What I was so surprised at in this order as well is that Trump got that right. It was so weird. He was like close on so much of the stuff. He said, quote, "The United States has for far too long turned its back on Americans who unwittingly sponsor both drug manufacturers and other countries." It's great. Yeah, these entities today rely on price markups on American consumers, generous public subsidies for research and development, primarily through the National Institutes of Health, and robust public financing of prescription drug consumption through federal and state healthcare programs. It was like, yes, dude, go Donald.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he's 100% right about that. Now, he did say at one point during his speech that, you know, again, he tried to make it seem like the reason why we were paying so much is because we were subsidizing other countries. As I just laid out for you, that's a complete bullshit talking point. So he's wrong about that. But the other stuff he is 100% right about.
Yeah,
right? Everything else he's 100% right about.
It is so funny because like he gets so close on diagnosing the problem, and then takes this crazy left turn to blame other countries. Like he said in the executive order, it said, quote, "Americans should not be forced to subsidize low-cost prescription drugs and biologics in other developed countries and face overcharges for the same products in the United States." And also, like, during his announcement, he literally talked about the fact that the healthcare companies, referring to the drug makers, should make about the same amount of money. And, quote, said, "I'm not knocking the drug companies. I'm really more knocking the other countries." So it's so frustrating that it was like, okay, dude, I'm ready to give you credit for diagnosing this problem correctly, and then takes this wild left turn to blame other countries that have stronger negotiating positions because they have like more robust centralized healthcare systems. Yeah.
To which, you know, the part of the solution for us would be to have a more centralized healthcare system, which is not what he's proposing. But here's the thing, like, you know, we're not comparing this to the ideal. We're comparing this to the status quo.
So
all right.
True.
And look, we try to be fair. We've been accused of Trump derangement syndrome in the past.
Yeah.
But we try to be fair. If he does a policy that we think is actually going to help, you know, we'll give him credit. And here's the thing that actually did give me a little bit of pause about this. And this is something that should give you pause about this as well, because when I first heard him say, "Oh, well, I'm knocking other countries," that made me think, okay, so does that mean that your order is basically just going to be try to raise the prices of other countries, or, like, you know, force companies to sell to raise their prices on other countries? That's not what the order says.
Yeah.
To be fair, that is not what the order says. Basically, it calls for, in 30 days, the companies, the pharmaceutical companies, need to come up with a plan to sell their drugs at the same rate as comparable countries, like the comparable lowest costs for other countries. All right. So if basically the lowest cost that this has for X country, you have to offer us that price in the United States. And one thing that gave me pause, that same CEO that I quoted earlier, who basically said that the reason why prices were so high in America was because we were subsidizing other countries. The same guy actually criticized this executive order. He said, quote, "Importing foreign crisis from socialist countries would be a bad deal for American patients and workers. It would be less treatment and cures and would jeopardize the hundreds of billions our member companies are planning to invest in America." So the fact that he's against it, this order, should actually somewhat make you think, oh, maybe this order might actually be good, because this is a corporate lobbyist. This is a guy who's paid to lie to you.
Yeah.
He's a guy who's paid to try to keep the status quo where pharmaceutical companies are jacking up prices as much as possible. And it's hilarious that when he says socialist countries, he's literally just referring to every single developed country that isn't the United States.
Yeah. Totally.
So, by this logic, every single country that isn't the United States is just a socialist country, which is
makes
just
me
a
think
stupid
maybe we should
fucking
try out
thing.
socialism. Maybe we'd finally get some good trains.
Yeah. Like that's the thing. When you say shit like that, that doesn't make us think that those countries are bad. That makes us think that socialism is good.
Yeah, we've been
all right?
to
And I
some
don't think
other
you want us to
countries,
do
so-
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I haven't, but
Yeah.
but yeah. So that kind of gave me pause. But then you actually look at the order itself, and basically after those 30 days, it then instructs the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, RFK Jr., to come up with a plan.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's hard to evaluate this because it's basically a declaration of it's like a politics declaration, not a policy declaration. It's like, I
Exactly.
wish drug prices were lower. And even in defining that next step, that if they don't make, quote, significant progress that would trigger the Health and Human Services Secretary to make this plan, significant progress is not defined. So it's totally open to the Trump administration going, yep, we did it, and having it just be political posturing. So it's hard to evaluate whether it would actually be effective because it's so vague on what it actually requires.
Yeah. Now, one thing, and I'm actually going to, if this does happen, this is a good thing. This is a good thing. But one of the things that this order does actually instruct is that if these pharmaceutical companies do not lower their prices and set them to the lowest price from other countries, if they do not do that, the order actually does threaten to start investigating them for anti-competitive practices in the United States. And if they did that and actually did a meaningful investigation, like it wasn't just a surface level bullshit, theater, that would actually be a really good thing, because one of the biggest issues in the United States is our patent laws. Our patent laws, as I kind of talked about earlier, allows those corporations that swoop in after a drug has been determined as less risky, that swoop in and buy those patents. They then allow them to basically prevent anybody from creating off-brand versions of that drug, which basically creates no competition. I mean, because here's the thing. There are lots of, you could make the argument that there are two different ways to lower prices, right? There's the socialist way, and then there's the capitalist way. The socialist way would be for the government to set those prices or negotiate those prices or regulate those prices. The capitalist way would be for multiple different companies to develop the same drug, and then they'd have to compete with each other in terms of what the price of the drug is. But what we have in the United States is basically just the worst of all worlds, where we don't have any regulation, but we also, in many cases, we don't have any competition either.
Yeah.
Because of patent laws. And if the Trump administration actually did a meaningful investigation into anti-competitive practices by pharmaceutical companies, and that actually opened the doors for more off-brand versions of common drugs, of necessary drugs to be developed and thus drive the prices down, that would actually be a really good thing. Like, that would actually make a huge difference. So like I genuinely hope that they're being serious about that.
Yeah.
But the issue is it's hard to really judge what ultimately this is going to come down to, because at the end of the day, the federal government really only is going to have power over is going to have buying power over pharmaceuticals bought through Medicare and Medicaid, not through private insurance. Now, the hope seems to be that within that 30 days, out of the kindness of their heart to fill this order, that these pharmaceutical companies are just going to lower it on everybody. But the fact of the matter is, the only negotiating power that a lot of legal experts would agree, the only negotiating power that they're going to have is specifically on drugs that are bought through Medicare and Medicaid, meaning that they would basically set their prices of, okay, well, we're not going to buy it unless it's this price.
Yeah.
That's what our final thing is going to be, which would still be significant, but most Americans have private insurance plans, which means it's not going to have as much of an effect. And it's definitely, Trump is claiming that this is going to have an immediate effect. It's definitely not going to have an immediate effect. And even if that plan is created, it would take years to implement. And honestly, what's most likely, the thing that is most likely to actually create meaningful negotiation of pharmaceutical prices, not just for Medicare and Medicaid, but also for private insurance, would actually be legislation. But that's going to take even longer, because Republicans are not going to be for that. Now, look, if Trump uses his bully pulpit to try to bully Republicans into supporting an actual decent piece of legislation that forces pharmaceutical negotiation, that would be great. If he actually does that, that would be great. And I would be I'll come on the pod and I will sing his praises. But here's the issue with this. Kind of like what he referred to, kind of the same way that he referred to his healthcare plan in the debate. This executive order is a concept of a plan.
Yeah.
It's not a plan. It is a concept of a plan. Now, its goals are good. All right. Its goals are good. The goal of setting pharmaceutical prices in line with that other countries pay, that is a good goal, and that is an important goal. But he doesn't really have any mechanism for actually doing it, and he doesn't have a meaningful plan for how to actually force that. So what I think that this is, what I think that this ultimately is this is going to give him something that he can bring back to his people, to his constituency, and basically say, hey, look what I did. We passed an executive order and it totally lowered your pharmaceutical prices. And, we know that at the end of the day, facts don't matter to his most ardent base. So he can tell them, oh yeah, so your insulin no longer costs like, $500. And they're going to be like, oh my God, it no longer costs $500. So I think that I think that it's possible that nothing's going to come from this, and he knows that nothing's going to come from it, but he's still going to use it in order to try to score political points, because he knows that negotiating pharmaceutical prices is popular among both Democrats and Republicans. And then when Democrats criticize him for it, he's going to be like, oh, so you're against this thing. You're against this thing because I'm for this thing. All right. I can't do anything with I can't do anything right. You're never going to give me credit for anything. It's like, okay, but you didn't actually do anything. I honestly think that's ultimately where this is going. I hope that I'm wrong. I genuinely hope that I'm wrong. And if the Trump administration does actually succeed in lowering prices to a significant degree, I'll come on the pod, say I was wrong, sing his praises.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, this is just a concept of a plan.